Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's session 5, French Imperialism in the Revolutionary Era. I'm David Markham, president of the International Napoleonic Society, and Knight of the Order of the French Academic Palms, and it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome all of you here today. I want to thank Alexander Macabrez in particular for asking me to host this program this morning. There's in Canada here, we have a sort of a talk news show called This Hour Has 22 Minutes. Well, one of our speakers today is recorded, and its recording is 22 minutes long. And so each speaker will have 22 minutes instead of the normal 20 minutes. So this session will have 3 22-minute talks to go with it. I want to also very briefly mention to you that the International Napoleonic Society Congress will be in Cork, Ireland, from the 3rd to the 10th of July this summer, and I invite all of you to participate in that. It will be in person, and we may have a virtual option as well. And I also have to point out that the International Napoleonic Society has a journal called Napoleonic Scholarship, and those of you who are doing papers in this session and any session, we invite you to submit them for peer review for publication in the premier English language academic journal devoted to Napoleonic and revolutionary topics. All of that said, we have a great session this morning. The first paper is called Interfaith Conflict in Egypt during the French occupation period 1798 to 1801. And I'm sorry, Alexander, I will probably butcher the pronunciation of your last name. I'm really bad with names, but Alexander Tchoudinov is the director of the laboratory World in the Age of the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars at the Institute of World History of the Russian Academy of Science. He is also the chief editor of the international periodical Annual of French Studies, author of several books, particularly the monograph, The Forgotten Army, the French in Egypt after Bonaparte. Should be a fascinating paper. Take it away. No, I'm not hearing you.
Dr. Tchoudinov, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Just a moment. Oh, okay.
Okay, there you are. Yeah, now you're good.
Okay, let's begin. Before the Bonaparte's conquest of Egypt, Muslims and Christians had lived there side by side for more than 12 centuries. By 1798, Christians were a relatively small minority in the country's population. Bonaparte himself estimated the number of Copts, the largest of the Christian communities, at 1 or 200,000 people, or from 3 to 7% of the 3 million total population. Today, historians estimate the population of Egypt at that time at 4.5 million people. But also note that the share of Copts among them did not exceed 7%. Other Christian communities, Syrians, Greeks, Western Europeans, or Franks, were significantly inferior in number to the Copts and in total barely reached 1% of the total population. In a predominantly Muslim society, the legal status of Christians had its own specifics. For them, there was a certain dress code. They had no right to tie a turban in the same way as Muslims did, and the turban of a Christian could only be of dark colors. Christians were not allowed to ride or to carry weapons. There were also other restrictions for them compared to Muslims. However, it did not mean in any way that the Christian population was rightless. On the contrary, in Egypt, the set of rights for Christians was even greater than in other regions of Ottoman Empire. In particular, only in Egypt they had the right to possess slaves. In general, the Christian minority was tightly integrated into Egyptian society, occupying its own specific niche. So, the top of Coptic community played a very important role in the government, traditionally performing the functions of tax collectors, accountants, and notaries. Planning the conquest of Egypt, the French did not count on any support from the local Christians. Talleyrand, in his project for the conquest of Egypt presented to the Directory in February 1798, mentioned the Copts only in connection with their traditional role in the country's financial system. Bonaparte, with his claim to convince the Muslims that of his superhuman nature as Mahdi, the prophet of the last times, not only did not count it on the local Christians, but on the contrary, tried to gain the trust of the Muslims by positioning himself as a persecutor of Christianity. I said, Qadi, Sheikhs, Chorbaji, tell the people that we are true Muslims. Did we not overthrow the Pope who said that we should wage war against Muslims? Did we not overthrow the Knights of Malta because these madmen believed that God wanted them to wage war against Muslims? At the end of citation. And even in his memoirs about the conquest of Egypt, written at St. Helena, Bonaparte almost ignored the role of Christians in the history of the expedition, except for a brief mention of the Copts' assistance in collecting taxes. However, the picture drawn by him in his memoirs should be considered not so much as a narrative about real events, but as an imaginary model of what Bonaparte wanted to achieve in Egypt. And since he hoped to subdue the country, first of all, by charming the Muslims and did not seek any help from the local Christians, the latter remained outside his ideal picture. In fact, even though Bonaparte already in the first days of his expedition declared his sympathy for Islam, the Muslim population perceived the French as enemies of their faith. From the very beginning, the war took on a religious character. Accordingly, the attitude of Muslims towards their infidel neighbors, next to whom they lived for decades, changed from friendly to suspicious, from neutral to hostile. As the French army approached the Egyptian capital, the populace of Cairo expressed a desire to kill all the Christians and Jews in the city, which only the local authorities did not allow to do. Bonaparte's attempts to gain the trust and sympathy of Muslims were unsuccessful. With the arrival of the French, the Muslims were extremely reluctant and not eager to cooperate with the occupation administration. On the contrary, the Egyptian Christians themselves took the initiative in establishing such contacts, receiving direct benefits from it. So Christian merchants, unlike Muslims not constrained by the taboo on alcohol, opened numerous zucchinis in which the French military could spend their leisure time. This leisure time was initially brightened up by local Christian and Jewish women, who were only much later joined by Muslim women. The cultural barrier that separated Christian and Jewish women from foreigners was much lower than that of Muslim women, and it was much easier for the first to get close to the French. Syrians and Greeks, who had long lived in Egypt and knew Arabic well, entered the service of the French authorities as interpreters. The Copts still held key positions in financial management, as Bonaparte used the same tax collection systems that had operated under the Mamluks. At the same time, with the arrival of the French, relations between the Christian and Muslim communities in Egypt became increasingly confrontational. Since the internal policy of the French occupation administration towards the local population was based mainly on terror, Christians who collaborated with the French often acted as executors of repression against Muslims. The most striking example of this kind is the activities of the infamous Barthélemy the Greek, or Barthélemy Serra. Under the Mamluks, he served as their gunner, being on the lower rank of the military hierarchy. With the arrival of the French, he became deputy chief of police and, in fact, the main executioner in the service of the occupation authorities. Having organized a detachment of foreigners, Greek, Maghrebins, and Berbers, every day he left the city with them to hunt the Bedouins and returned with several bleeding heads. In those days, when these anti-brigands fighters could not meet the Bedouins, they cut off the heads of ordinary peasants. The main thing for Barthélemy and his associates was the incessant intimidation of the Egyptians, since it was terror that allowed 35,000 Frenchmen to keep in subjection more than 4 million of the local population who hated them. Even the Copts serving in the finance department now assumed a repressive attitude to their normal duties. Since they were now accompanied by French military detachments on their trips to the villages, the tax collectors, according to the Arab chronicler Al-Jabarti, behaved like sovereign rulers. They imprisoned local inhabitants, beat them, and engaged in extortion. Denunciations of Muslims by Christians to the French became a common practice. Servants who wanted to take the revenge on masters denunciated them. Participants of street conflicts did the same. Since the French occupation administration was constantly looking for ways to replenish its treasury, such denunciations became a pretext for imposing additional fines and contributions on the Muslims. If the denunciation was of a political nature and contained an accusation of a person's secret ties with the Mamluks who had fled the city, then the victim of such a denunciation could lose his life. Already during the first 3 months of the French occupation, relations between Muslims and Christians reached such a sharp point that with the beginning of the first Cairo uprising in October 1798, the anger of the crowd turned not only against the French, but also against the local Christians. Many Christian homes were looted, and the city mob committed, as Al-Jabarti wrote, many shameful deeds against them. After the suppression of the uprising, it was time for revenge. The Christians turned to the French in search of the retribution, and with their help not only regained what they had previously lost, but also actively appropriated the property of the Muslims. I cite, taking advantage of the opportunity, Al-Jabarti wrote, they showed the dislike of the Muslims that lurked in their huts. Barthélemy the Greek, under the pretext of searching for the stolen property, sent many persons to the dungeon where they were tortured. He behaved like a tyrant and committed all sorts of injustice, wrote Al-Jabarti. The French authorities, in order to calm the Muslim population, even had to shoot several Copts who especially distinguished themselves in looting, and once again publicly declared the love of the French for Islam. Nevertheless, as the Arab chronicler testifies, the rules of behavior prescribed earlier for Christians by Muslim society tradition were no longer observed. At this time, the Christians in the service of the French, Copts, Syrians, Greeks, as well as Jews from the lower strata of society, began to behave arrogantly. They rode and carried weapons with a smug air, made smug speeches in public, and humiliated the dignity of Muslims. The final citation. During the Syrian campaign, when there were very few French troops left in Egypt, the occupation administration strictly required local Christians to observe their traditional restrictions so as not to anger the Muslims. However, after the return of the army from Syria, and especially after the victory of Bonaparte over the Turks at Abu Qir, the behavior of the Christians became even more defiant than before. According to contemporaries, this was especially evident during the annual festival in honor of the flood of the Nile. I cite, the Christians living in the city, the Copts, Syrians, and Greeks, came out of their homes and prepared for celebration, festivities, entertainment, joy, and fun. On this night, they went beyond all bounds of decency. Imitating the former Mamluk bays, they took boats with a lot of oars, sat in them with their wives and prostitutes, took wine with them, laughed brazenly, said abominations, blasphemed, mocked at the Muslims, and imitated them. At the end of citation. The tension in the relations between the confessions was growing. Remembering the events of the first Cairo uprising, when the hatred of Muslims against the occupiers and collaborators fell first on the Christian community, the Copts fortified their quarter in Cairo and stocked up on weapons and ammunition. These precautions proved useful after the start of the second Cairo uprising in March 1800. It also began with the pogrom of Christians by Muslims. And while in other parts of the city, many Christians died at the hands of the Muslims, the Copts, entrenched in their quarter, were able to withstand the siege for a month until the French troops suppressed the uprising. In the last year of the French stay in Egypt, the cooperation of Christians with occupants reached the highest level. The French generals formed special units from Copts, Greeks, and Syrians, mainly engaged in police and punitive functions. This made the relationship between Egyptian Christians and Muslims really antagonistic. As a result, during the evacuation of the French from Egypt, those representatives of the local Christian elites who worked most closely with the occupiers were forced to leave the country with them. Many of the remaining Christians, after the arrival of the Turks, became victims of revenge on the part of the Muslims. Let's sum up. By bringing to Egypt the new values that had become dominant in France during the revolution, Napoleon's army unwittingly broke the fragile interconfessional consensus that had ensured the long and fairly peaceful coexistence of the Muslim majority and the Christian minority there. Formally, Christians received equal rights with Muslims. However, in practice, thanks to their cultural proximity to the occupants and active cooperation with the French administration, the Christians achieved complete dominance in Egyptian society during this period. In a matter of weeks, this previously restricted religious minority, which was nevertheless organically integrated into the local society, turned into a tyrannical minority that rose above this society and subjected it to cruel oppression. Thank you.
David?
Thank you.
I think David is not coming up.
Okay. I'm using my wife's computer, so I'm not, there we go. Thank you very much for that very excellent talk. I appreciate that. I also want to remind people if you have questions, to put them in the chat room, sent to me, so that we can deal with them at the end of the program. Now, this next program, our next paper is recorded, and so I assume that after my introduction, Alex, you will be able to start it for us. It's called Napoleon's Alleged Letter to the Jews, 1799. Professor Richard Landis was trained as a medievalist at the École Normale Supérieure and Princeton University. He taught at the Boston University History Department for most of his teaching career, and now retired as an independent historian living in Jerusalem. His work focuses on apocalyptic and millennial beliefs, initially about the turn of the first millennium, Y1K, now primarily on movements at the turn of the second millennium, Y2K. Recent publications include Heaven on Earth, The Varieties of the Millennial Experience, Oxford 2011, and The Paranoid Apocalypse, a 100-year retrospective on the protocols of the Elders of Zion, New York University 2011. He's about to publish a book on 2000, Moral Disorientations, a medievalist guide to the 21st century, after which he hopes to complete his magnum opus, While God Tarried, Disappointed Millennialism from Jesus to the Peace of God, 33 to 1033. Sounds pretty fascinating. And now, Alexander, if you will get the recording going.
Franz Kobler, a Viennese lawyer and amateur historian, published a text he claimed was a German translation of Napoleon Bonaparte's proclamation to the Jews of 1799, calling on them to reclaim their sovereignty after millennia of powerlessness. Reaction to this find varies wildly. Many historians dismiss it as a fake of a declaration Napoleon never issued. Others accept it as a copy of the original. I propose a millennial analysis of the tale, one in which one must take account of the dynamics of apocalyptic time in order to get the crooked story straight. Let me begin with some definitions. Let me start with a definition of millennialism and eschatology and apocalyptic. Eschatological refers to the end of the world entirely, last judgment, heaven, hell. Millennial refers to the perfection of this world in the flesh, in history. Millennialism is always political in the sense that it views the current rulers of this world as evil and anticipates them being overthrown and replaced with anything from an imperial, a messianic imperial rule, or the kingdom of the saints and holy anarchy. Apocalyptic is the key term here. I use it to refer to, on the one hand, a sense of imminence, and on the other hand, the scenario whereby those who believe that the end is imminent or the transformation is imminent view the coming process. I refer to roosters as people who believe that the apocalyptic moment is now, and to owls as those who say, no, go back to sleep. The master's asleep, the foxes are out, and you can only do damage by waking up the barnyard. Among the varieties of millennialism I wish to deal with, let's stick with the horizontal axis. On the right hand, egalitarian bottom up. On the right hand, on the left hand, totalitarian hierarchical top down. Among the apocalyptic variants, it's important to distinguish a number of them. On the horizontal axis between transformative or nonviolent, voluntary. On the left, cataclysmic, evil must be destroyed, massively destroyed, before the way can be made for the kingdom of heaven, whether it's in heaven or on earth. Passive being we have to wait. For instance, premillennial dispensationalist Christians believe that God will bring a rapture, bring the saved up into the heavens, bring on a terrible period, cataclysmic period of tribulation, and then return the saved to earth for the millennium. That would be a passive cataclysmic scenario. But the more secular you are, the more active your scenarios, and therefore destroying the world to save it becomes a favorite trope of certain forms of apocalyptic expectation. The key here is apocalyptic time. All apocalyptic movements fail, and so you have here the sort of entry into the public sphere, the articulation of an apocalyptic discourse. It takes off at the moment where it becomes public, and rather than being repressed and ridiculed and even suppressed, the roosters wax, the owls wane, and you have an actual apocalyptic movement on hand. Not all movements reach the next stage, but the next stage is crucial, and that is the seizure of power when the roosters are in power, at which point inevitably they face disappointment in their expectations of what would happen once they took power, and it leads to a period of failure, a loss of power, a re-entry into normal time, and finally a retreat into the private sphere where, in fact, roosters disguise themselves as owls and pretend they never said anything that has subsequently been proven false. Now, this causes problems for historians because although, and in my opinion as a historian of millennial movements, you have significant ones virtually every generation, certainly in Western history, whereas the contemporary gaze goes this way and you see the power of the roosters during their moment. Most of the documentation is written subsequently by owls who dislike, if not hate, roosters and disdain them as false prophets and other negative terms. And so what you have is the historian's gaze goes backward, and what it sees is just a wall of owl-written, anti-apocalyptic, dismissive comments and documents about previous apocalyptic movements. And as a result, you historians tend to be bats in Plato's cave. That is, the Vesperian School, which is the dominant school, takes the wall of anti-apocalyptic documentation as a flat reality. They use dismissive rhetoric, not a shred of evidence. They ridicule, they're hostile. The Aurorian School, in which I like to think of myself, tries to jump backward in time and look forward and see the live apocalyptic movement before its failure. Now, what I'd like to do is to look at the French Revolution in terms of this, the articulation of a millennial discourse I take to be the Enlightenment. It's with its secular version of millennial hopes. Kant put it nicely: everyone can see that philosophy can have her belief in millenarianism, what he called chiliasmos, but hers is not wildly exuberant, schwärmerisch, which is the term that, among others, Martin Luther used to condemn the craziness of the peasants' revolution in 1525. So here we have the takeoff comes with the calling of the Estates General, when not only were there great fears, but there were also great hopes expressed by many people, both the representatives to the Estates General as well as to the commoners who saw this taking place. The taking of power, traditionally one might argue, is the 14th of July, Bastille Day, but I think a key moment would be the night of August 4th, in which voluntarily, as a sort of classic transformative apocalyptic scenario towards a demotic millennium, the aristocracy renounces their rights and their privileges before the law, from liberté with an S to liberté for everybody. Of course, failure is in the making, and you know, the millennial premise of the French Revolution, which was that if only you free people from unjust oppression, then the virtuous citizen will naturally arrive, didn't quite happen. And what we have is, of course, people engaged in all kinds of dishonest activity, and as a result, food shortages and counter-revolutionary impulses and so on. And the combination of both paranoia and what is a characteristic of disappointed millennialism that will not let go of apocalyptic time is the turn to coercive purity, that somehow we can literally carve out a perfect society on the body social, which was the terror, and eventually the loss of power. So here would be, for instance, the execution of Robespierre, if you will, and then finally the re-entry into normal time with the Directory, and then in the bigger picture, the retreat to the private sphere, and the return to the restoration of the monarchy. But what I want to look at is a sort of second curve that takes off from the Directory, and that would be Napoleon. While it's easy to describe the Directory as a return to normal time, that underestimates the latent and profound desires of people who have tasted apocalyptic time and refuse to let go. The Directory may have cooled the mad violence of the terror and seen the resurfacing of banal corruption and venality in the ruling elite, but it still fed on the fantasy of revolutionary dream. And as the Directory struggled and stumbled, Napoleon rose. Already in Italy, he later claimed in St. Helena, he had seen the world recede beneath me as if I were being borne up into the sky. In this context, I think one needs to see Napoleon as an effort to restore the intensity of apocalyptic hope with a new variant of revolutionary fervor, authoritarian in its implementation, demotic in its principles. First articulated in the Belgian campaign of 1792, Bonaparte saw his brilliant generalship as a means of revolutionary transformation. War on castles, peace to the cottages. Incidentally, a similar sentiment animated the earliest expansion of Islam through jihad. Indeed, Napoleon's generalship was only one side of his messianic coin, the other, the millennial legislator, implementer of the revolutionary dream of equality before the law, le Code Napoleon. Some contemporaries viewed Napoleon either as Messiah or Antichrist throughout his career. However, at certain points in his own career, he shared the former view. Certainly, as a consummate master of propaganda, he did not hesitate to encourage others to believe the most of him and his mission. Now, the motives for the Middle Eastern campaign were varied. The Directory had primarily pragmatic concerns, while Napoleon's were considerably more elevated. He dreamed of becoming a new Alexander, conquering now British India, embarking on a conquest that, quote, will change the world. And his initial victories in Egypt reinforced that. But by late 1798, he found himself beset by the painful workings of what Augustine had described as the cycle of plagues, prostitution, protests, all undermining his sublime goals. And as a result, he chose not to go to India, but to head north into Palestine. In 1805, Emperor Napoleon reminisced about how he thought in the spring of 1799. Had I won, I would have put on a turban, I would have made my soldiers wear big Turkish trousers, and I would have exposed them to battle only in the case of extreme necessity. I would have made them into a sacred battalion, my immortals. I would have finished the war against the Turks with Arab, Greek, and Armenian troops and returned to Paris by way of Constantinople. This reminiscence, however shaped by subsequent events, is confirmed by multiple contemporary sources, prompting the historian Paul Strathern to note, quote, "The self-conviction required for such an unprecedented ambition in a sane mind very much in contact with reality can only be imagined." And I suggest that one best imagines such a mind as the product of millennial dreams that had flamed bright only a decade ago among the French people, and which he tried to communicate to the inhabitants of the Orient, all victims, in his mind at least, of Ottoman oppression. His aspiration was to be a revolutionary messiah, to take possession of an imperial glory that would have rewritten the very boundaries of civilization and sovereignty on a global scale. It's in this framework that I suggest interpreting his alleged proclamation to the Jews, dated April 20th, 1799, issued from Jerusalem, a place he never went, but shortly after his spectacular victory against Ottoman troops at Mount Tabor and shortly before his defeat at Acre. The text itself does not exist, and Napoleon in his extensive memoirs never mentions it. But contemporary dispatches and reports of conversations mention such a proclamation, including the semi-official Moniteur Universel. Bonaparte published a proclamation in which he invites all of the Jews of Asia and Africa to rally to his banner in order to reestablish ancient Jerusalem. He has already armed a great number of them, and their battalions threaten Aleppo. Not until 1939 did a trace of the alleged document surface in Vienna and get smuggled to London to Franz Kobler, a Czech-born Jewish lawyer who wrote an extensive work on Napoleon and the Jews, in which he presents the document as a German translation of the French original. The circumstances, along with the very tenuous chain of custody, have prompted great skepticism among historians, especially those who see Napoleon as a shrewd and realistic strategist and take into account his subsequent relation with the Jews. Ultimately, it comes down to which one Napoleon one imagines: the Vesperian view backwards through the later Napoleonic friction with the Jews, or the Aurorian school's view forward of an invincible Napoleon, child of destiny. Let us for a moment consider the text as a reasonably good translation of an actual French or Hebrew original. On the apocalyptic curve, it represents a critical moment, one in which accelerating apocalyptic momentum has been frustrated at Acre, and Napoleon has chosen emphatically to press forward. Unlike so many texts written ex post defecto in disappointment's aftermath, Napoleon wrote ex ante while his apocalyptic ambitions were still white hot. The letter itself is a fully millennial document where a man who is reshaping world history speaks in the Blakean language of visionary politics. Arise then with gladness, ye exiled, a war unexampled in the annals of history. By a stroke of the pen of cabinets, Napoleon was a big fan of the printing press, avenges its own shame and the shame of the remotest nations. The almost 2,000-year ignominy put upon you offers to you at this time, and contrary to all expectations, Israel's patrimony. The young army with which Providence has sent me hither, led by justice and accompanied by victory, claim the restoration of civic rights among the population of the universe, which had been shamefully withheld from them for thousands of years. The text sheds light on a moment of revolutionary fervor still burning brightly after the terror now come in contact with pre-modern political cultures. Napoleon sees himself as an emissary of providence, bearing the enlightened ideal of freedom for all mankind, justice to the whole world. Far from the treacherous confines of revolutionary Paris, he cast his conqueror's gaze upon the global horizons of a world filled with oppressed people yearning for freedom. He performed on a stage of history those thousands of years that contemplated his army's inexorable march, a war unexampled in the annals of history, conducted by a young army whose commander, sent by Providence, fought for justice and everywhere had victory. In this world, it becomes self-evidently clear that the Jews deserve their own nation. They who had survived despite everything. From an enlightened revolutionary point of view, if any entity in history had been shamefully deprived of sovereignty, it was the Jews. Nor was Napoleon alone in this thinking. In June 8th, 1798, less than a month after Bonaparte sailed from Toulon for Egypt, the French revolutionary newspaper, L'Ami des Lois, published a Lettre d'un Juif à ses frères, a letter from a Jew to his brothers, translated from the Italian, the earliest modern Zionist manifesto that sought to, quote, reconcile the notion of a Jewish state with the secular and universalistic principles of the Age of Reason. In February of that year, an Irish patriot who had served in the Revolutionary Army wrote the chief director, Paul Barras, a letter that echoes closely Napoleon's appeal. You are scattered over all the surface of the earth, nowhere as a nation, vilified and degraded by bigoted governments and insulted by populaces. Learn from the armies of Bonaparte that art in which you were formerly so distinguished, but from which you are at the moment excluded by all the powers on earth. These sentiments united both the French revolutionaries and those like Priestley in Philadelphia and William Blake in London to rejoice. They also reflect a typical modern inversion of the rules of pre-modern shame-honor cultures pointed out by Anthony Appia. What was previously considered honorable, duels, slaveholding, vengeance murders, now became shameful behavior. In this case, what supersessionist Christians and Muslims had considered key components of their triumphalist religions were viewed as shameful. Napoleon was, of course, light years ahead of his political contemporaries in both international relations and Zionism. Indeed, ahead of his future self, which may explain his later silence on the subject of this proclamation. Here, he evanescently articulated a notion of global national sovereignties that constitute the founding principles of the UN. Bonaparte and Courbet both give voice to a demotic millennial attitude of generosity towards the Jews, which had previously characterized only the strangest of millennial visionaries and most forward-thinking of revolutionaries. Here we find a demotic concept of a messianic age, one in which the Jews had their own identity. For Jews, Cyrus represents the very type of the Gentile Messiah, and for Napoleon, nothing better suited his most extravagant pretensions. Rather than dismiss this document as an aberrant anomaly and a forgery, it yields far more insight and texture. If one approaches it as a white-hot apocalyptic document, especially rare in that it comes before, just before, the acknowledgement that the millennial dream, at least in its Oriental version, had failed. It gives us a window into the fevered brain of a messianic conqueror who still had a long career ahead of him. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, I can't thank our speaker, Professor Landis, directly, since this is a recording, and he will be unavailable for questions. And speaking thereof, I want to remind you all again that if you have any questions that you would like to put to the two speakers who will be here in person, so to speak, please send them to me in the chat. Our third paper is called The Geopolitical Transformation of the Italian Peninsula under Napoleon, 1796 to 1814. My good friend Alex Grab is a mainstay of Napoleonic conferences such as this one. He is an emeritus professor of history at the University of Maine, having taught there for some 33 years. He is a fellow of the International Napoleonic Society, holding his top academic award, the Legion of Honor, and participant in the Consortium of the Revolutionary Era since 1988. His book, Napoleon and the Transformation of Europe, received the INS's first award for the best book on Napoleon, published in 2003. He is also the author of more than 40 articles. It's a great personal pleasure to introduce to you Professor Alex Grab.
Dr. Grab, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So thank you very much, David, for this introduction. I will switch the talk to the Italian Peninsula, the geopolitical transformation of Italy under Napoleon. And let me start by saying a few things about the unique position that the Italian Peninsula had in the career, in the life, in the biography, in the achievements of Napoleon Bonaparte. First of all, I will remind people that the family's origin was from Tuscany, his forefathers. Secondly, of course, everybody knows that Napoleon began his military career, his European reputation in the Italian Peninsula in 1796. The campaign of 1796-97 really launched his military reputation. He reshaped the map of Italy, more of the Italian Peninsula, more than anybody else, any other territory in Europe, with the exception of Germany. He established, of course, several new states, wiped out the old states, and I will talk about this more. He crowned no less than 6 of his relatives in the Italian Peninsula as rulers, more than any other country in Europe. And again, I will talk a little bit about them later. Rome, when Rome was annexed to the Napoleonic Empire, and a son was born to him from his second wife, Marie-Louise, he gave him the title, the King of Rome. Rome actually became the second capital of his empire. Of course, Italy was extremely important for his continental blockade, and we heard yesterday a little bit about the continental blockade by Michael Legier. Italy was extremely important for the blockade against Britain. And Italy was also a major supplier of soldiers who fought in Spain, in Germany, in Russia. For example, in the Russian campaign, no less than the Kingdom of Italy, the Northern Kingdom of Italy, supplied 27,000 soldiers. Only 1,000 of them returned. More, of course, were supplied by other lands in Italy that were annexed to France and, of course, southern Italy. Now, the types of changes that Napoleon established in the Italian Peninsula were of 2 major categories. First of all, the geopolitical changes, establishing, wiping out, eliminating the old regime states and establishing new states and crowning new rulers. So this was one category of changes. The other category were, of course, reforms in many areas administrative, educational, financial, military, health, and so on and so forth. Many, many reforms throughout the Italian peninsula. Those reforms were based on the French model. Essentially, what Napoleon wanted to do with Italy, as he wanted to do with the rest of his empire, European empire, was, I would use the word Frenchify Europe, establish Europe like on the basis of the French model, the French Revolution and his reforms. And Italy experienced those reforms to a very large scale, and many of them, of course, remained also after his elimination. Now,
Dr. Grab, you advanced.
Here.
Yes, there you go. Thank you.
Okay. So first of all, I want to show you Italy in the 18th century, before the invasion of Napoleon into Italy. 1796, this was his invasion, and you can see that Italy is divided to 9 states: Piedmont, Lombardy, Parma, Modena, Tuscany, or the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, of course, the Papal State, and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, or the Kingdom of Naples. So very much divided, and this division, of course, has been going on since the Middle Ages. And all this structure that you can see here, all this geopolitical structure that you can see in this map, will be eliminated by Napoleon, and we will see that a new structure was established, and I will talk about this. Now, Napoleon invaded Italy in 1796. Here you see a photo, some kind of a painting of Napoleon enters Milan, the capital of Lombardy, the most important city in northern Italy. He conquered Lombardy from the Austrians. He beat the Austrians in a number of battles. He beat also the Piedmontese, and basically established French control over northern Italy. But he didn't just win the battles. He also completely reshaped the map of northern Italy. And I'm talking about 1796, 1797. He established several republics, which were called sister republics, supportive of France, with French structure, administrative, financial, educational, and so on and so forth structure. The most important republic was the Cisalpine Republic, which lasted for about 2.5 years until it was eliminated by the Allied forces. He established also the Ligurian Republic with the city of Genoa. Again, as I said, he introduced a whole bunch of French laws and structures. Another very important change during those early years, 1797, was the elimination of Venice and the Veneto as an independent state. Venice has existed for about 1,000 years with the Veneto, the area around Venice, for about 1,000 years, and now it came to an end, and it would never regain its independent structure, independent existence. Okay, so this was again a very, very important geopolitical change of Napoleon in 1797. In the Peace of Campo Formio, 1797, which he signed with the Austrian Empire, he gave the Austrian Empire the Veneto in return for the Austrians recognizing the rule of France in northern Italy. Later on, he would take Venice and the Veneto from the Austrian in 1806. So this was the first stage of the Napoleonic conquest and changes in the Italian peninsula. Later, after he returned to Paris, the French armies conquered also the Papal State. They conquered also the Kingdom of Naples in 1798. But at that point, Napoleon was not anymore in Italy. He later, as you know, left for Egypt. When he came from Egypt, of course, in 1799, of course, he took power in the famous school of Brumaire. Everybody knows about this. And in 1800, as a first consul, he returned to Italy. Crossed the Alps. Yeah, here we have this is a picture of Napoleon crossing the Alps, a painting by a painter called De La Roche. This is from 1848. This is not during the Napoleonic period. Past the Napoleonic period, of course, Napoleon would have never allowed such a painting to be drawn during his period. Actually, I have included the famous painting of Jacques-Louis David, Napoleon crossing the Alps, which is kind of glorifying way of crossing the Alps. But this is something more realistic of how he crossed the Alps on a mule, not on a stallion, and led by a peasant with kind of shabby a coat. At any rate, he marched into back into the Lombard plains in 1800 and was able to beat, with a little bit of luck, I would say, with the Se, to beat the Austrians in the famous Battle of Marengo, June 14th, 1800. And with this, he re-established the French control over northern Italy, Lombardy, Modena, the northern part of the papal state, and also Piedmont. And this will basically begin the second stage of the Napoleonic rule over Italy. After the first 3 years, right, that I mentioned earlier, now came the second phase of the Napoleonic rule over the Italian peninsula, which lasted from 1800 to 1814, and gradually he occupied the rest of the Italian peninsula and established their new states, wiping their old states. Now, this here I have. Okay, here you have the Battle of Marengo, and okay, so the changes that I was talking about, the geopolitical changes from 1800 to 1810 or 1814, if you will, were carried out in 3 phases. The first set of geopolitical changes took place from 1800 to 1802 for the first 2 years. What were the important changes during this period? He established a republic, the Republic of Italy, in the northern part of Italy. That included Lombardy, it included Modena, the city of Modena, it included Bologna, which belonged to the Pope. This was the Republic of Italy, which lasted from 1802 till 1805. He was the president. He established himself as the president of this republic. But of course, he was in Paris, so he had a representative in Milan, a man by the name of Count Melzi Deril, who was a Milanese patrician. So this was the first important change of Napoleon after 1800. The second important change was geopolitical change, was the annexation of Piedmont, right? Which before Napoleon invaded Italy was an independent state. And of course, later on in 1860, 1850s and 1860 would lead the unification of Italy. But right now, Napoleon annexed Piedmont into the French Empire, okay? He also extended his rule over Parma, which was another duchy in the northern part, and also there established a new rule. And in 1803, he established out of Tuscany, out of Grand Duchy of Tuscany, he established a new kingdom, the kingdom he called the Kingdom of Etruria, right, from the name, from the early inhabitants there, the Etruscans. And again, it was under a rule of a woman by Maria Luisa, who was to a very large degree subject to the Napoleonic rule. So those were the first changes of Napoleon from 1800 to about 1802, 1803. The next phase of geopolitical changes came in 1805, 1806. He was, as you know, he was crowned as an emperor in December 1804, right? And there, once he became an emperor, he could not remain the president of a republic, of the Italian Republic. And so therefore he changed the Italian Republic, or the Republic of Italy, into the Kingdom of Italy. So the Kingdom of Italy now became a new state. He was the King of Italy. This was his, aside from the title of Emperor of France, he was the King of Italy, of this northern Italian state. And in Milan, the capital of the Kingdom of Italy, he nominated a man by the name of his actually stepson, a man by the name of Eugene de Beauharnais. Eugene de Beauharnais was the son of Josephine de Beauharnais, the first wife of Napoleon. So once Napoleon married her, he adopted Eugene and Hortense. This was another daughter of Josephine. And to a very large degree, Eugene de Beauharnais came under his protection. He also took him to various battles. He nominated him to high military ranks. And in 1805, he sent him to Milan to be the viceroy, to be his deputy in Milan. And Eugene served as the viceroy in Milan until 1814, until the Kingdom of Italy collapsed. So this was a very, very important change in Italy. I would say that the Kingdom of Italy, this northern state of Italy, which expanded gradually, as I will show, became probably the most loyal state, with Eugene, the most loyal ruler of a state to Napoleon. He remained loyal to him until the very end, until 1814. And the Kingdom of Italy was also a state which experienced very successful reforms, because not every state in Europe experienced the same success of reforms that Napoleon introduced. But the Kingdom of Italy in particular experienced large number and very successful reforms with this loyalty of Eugene de Beauharnais. Again, I would remind you what I said earlier, that to the Russian campaign, the Kingdom of Italy sent 27,000 soldiers. There was a pretty successful conscription law there, etc. The second important, maybe I should, again, here you see the symbol, the flag of the Kingdom of Italy. The second important change, geopolitical change in 1805, 1806 was the fact that Napoleon took away from the Austrian Empire the Veneto. Remember, he gave the Veneto in the Peace of Campo Formia in 1797, and now after Austerlitz, after the defeat of the Russians and the Austrians, Napoleon signed the Peace of Pressburg with the Austrian Emperor, and part of the price that the Austrians had to pay was to give Napoleon the Veneto and Venice, and this area he annexed to the Kingdom of Italy. So the Kingdom of Italy was now expanding with the addition of the Veneto. So this was again another important change. Here you see the entire Kingdom of Italy within the Napoleonic Empire. This green color in the Italian peninsula. This is the Kingdom of Italy, right? Consisting now of Lombardy, the Veneto, Bologna, and Modena, and later on it would extend also at the expense of the papal power. The third important change during this 1805-1806 period was the invasion of the French into the Kingdom of Naples, or as it was known, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. What happened was that Ferdinand, the ruler of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, joined the Third Coalition. And because of this, Napoleon decided to punish him, to punish his and basically invaded under General Massena the Kingdom of Naples, conquered it fairly quickly. Although after this, he had to, his forces had to fight and suppress a pretty ferocious brigand rebellion, which lasted for at least 2 years, and even remnants of it after. At any rate, he established now the Kingdom of Naples. In this way, he occupied the southern part of Italy, and here he established his brother, his older brother Joseph, as the ruler, as the king of Naples. Of course, later on he would move in 1808. 2 years later, he would move Joseph to Spain, and he would establish Joachim Murat. He would establish, right, Joachim Murat, which you see here in 1808, as the ruler of the Kingdom of Naples. Joachim Murat was actually his brother-in-law, very successful cavalry commander of the Napoleonic Empire, and now he got his reward by getting the Kingdom of Naples, together with the sister of Napoleon, Caroline. She was the queen of the Kingdom of Naples. So here you have the expansion of Napoleon in 1806 into southern Italy. So by now he's really ruling over almost the entire Italian peninsula. But taking the rest of the peninsula would come in the third phase, 1807, 1809, 1810. What he did during this third stage was taking over primarily the papal state, and also establishing, annexing also Tuscany into the French Empire. By that point, by 1806, of course, the Continental Blockade had been proclaimed. The Berlin Decree had been proclaimed by Napoleon, and he had, of course, to control all the coasts of Europe. And of course, Italy has got very long coasts. He had to control all the coasts because Italy was, of course, in a very important strategic position in the Mediterranean Sea. I should add that Sicily was not, did not come under French rule. The Bourbons fled from Naples into Palermo and continued to rule over Sicily under the English rule, or the English protection. In addition to this, the island of Malta, of course, was under English rule. And so from Sicily and Malta, English products could be smuggled into Italy, maybe into the area of the Adriatic Sea and into Europe. Hence, it was absolutely necessary to control all the coasts. The papal state had a pretty long coast along the Adriatic Sea, and therefore Napoleon simply annexed, at first in 1807, parts of the 1807, 1808, he annexed parts of the papal state along the Adriatic Sea, especially with the port city of Ancona. In 1808, now I should add the Pope, Pius the Seventh, the Pope Pius VII did not want to cooperate with Napoleon over the Continental Blockade. He did not want to close the papal ports, Civitavecchia and other areas, to English goods. He wanted to remain neutral between England and France, but Napoleon did not agree to this neutrality. There were other areas of conflict between Napoleon and the Pope, and therefore he ordered his army to invade Rome. take over the city of Rome. The Pope reacted by excommunicating Napoleon, and in 1809, Napoleon exiled the Pope Pius VII into first of all into Savona in northern Italy, and then to the into the palace of Fontainebleau, where the Pope remained until 1814, when he, of course, was allowed to return to Rome and resume his term as a Pope until 1823. So what he did with Rome and the whole area of Lazio, he annexed them to the French Empire, along with Tuscany in 1808, Parma again. And so by this point, Napoleon has full control over the entire Italian peninsula. And you can see, this is, of course, the Pope crowning him, the famous painting of Jacques-Louis David, Le Sacre. But here you have the structure of Italy under the final structure of Italy under the Napoleonic rule, right? So what you see here are 4 parts. Remember, earlier there were no less than 9 states. Now you have 3 to 4 units. The blue color is, of course, areas that were annexed to the French Empire: Piedmont, Liguria, Tuscany, Rome, Parma. The green, the green area in northern Italy is, of course, the Kingdom of Italy, where Napoleon was the king and Eugene de Beauharnais was the viceroy. And in the south, you have the Kingdom of Naples, first under his brother Joseph from 1808, under his brother-in-law Joachim Murat. 2 areas that remained outside, 2 areas of today's Italy, right, that remained outside the Napoleonic control were Sicily and Sardinia. Sardinia used to belong to the Piedmont, and it remained independent. Notice that those are 2 islands, and therefore it was difficult for Napoleon to control them because, of course, the English Navy, the English fleet still dominated the Mediterranean, and in this way protected both the independent existence of Sicily under the Neapolitan Bourbons and the island of Sardinia under the Piedmontese King Charles Emmanuel IV. So basically, I should also add that Napoleon also took care. I'm not sure exactly how I return to earlier slides, but he also took care of his 3 sisters, giving them territories in Italy. And maybe the most important one was Elisa Bonaparte. She ruled over the city of Lucca. You can see here on the map, Lucca is a different color, very beautiful city, and it was a separate principality under the rule of this sister, Elisa Bonaparte, again, who was a very competent ruler and introduced large number of reforms. I should tell you one interesting reform was that she obliged all the inhabitants of her principality to be vaccinated against smallpox. I don't think that any other state in Europe actually was, any other ruler forced the inhabitants, the citizens of his state to, but Elisa Bonaparte did it. The other sister was, of course, Caroline Bonaparte, who was the wife of Joachim Murat, and so she was the ruler together with Joachim Murat of the Kingdom of Naples, and another sister, Pauline Bonaparte, who also received a small territory in Italy. So in this way,
we have about 1 minute.
Okay, now so those are the geopolitical restructuring of Italy. You can see big difference between the way Italy looked before Napoleon entered or invaded Italy and the way that Italy looked during his period by 1810. I should also maybe finish here by saying that there was some legacy, geopolitically, there was some legacy of Napoleon after his collapse. Of course, the Congress of Vienna tried to reestablish Italy as much as possible under its former shape of the old regime, but still there were some changes. For example, Veneto and Venice never regained their independence. Venice became part of the Austrian Empire until it became, it was annexed to the Italian United Kingdom in 1866. Genova never regained its independence. Genova and the Italian Republic never regained its independence. It became part of Piedmont. Lombardy and came under, of course, back under the Austrian rule. The Pope, Pius VII, returned. The duchies of Tuscany, Parma, Modena, Lucca, again, also remained independent until the Italian unification, and of course also the Kingdom of Naples until 1859, when Garibaldi, of course, invaded. So this is what I have to say about the restructuring of Napoleon. One last comment I should make is that some historians see in this formation, in this elimination of many states and the formation of larger states as a step towards Italian unification. So this is also a version in the Italian historiography that the Napoleonic period constituted a step towards Italian unification, as you can see in the map, in the new map of Italy. But again, the map did not stay after the collapse of Napoleon. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Let me, oh, there it is. Okay. Thank you very much, Alex. That was an excellent presentation, as we have always come to expect from you. I want to remind everybody that we have an opportunity now to ask questions. You need to send your questions to me in the chat, and then I will read them. We have a question for Alex Grab from Doyana. Let's see. The pro-Giacombini in various Italian regions supported French-led transformations on the assumption that the French model had universal applicability, or at least that it could be adapted to Italian realities. How widespread was this belief? I am thinking of Pietro Verne, who in 1796 asked, "Are we, Italians, fit to live in a regime of liberty?" This is a letter to his brother Alessandro. Let me make sure I've got the whole question here. Yes, that's the question.
So the question is how adaptable was Italy to the Napoleonic reforms? Is this and the whole idea of
how widespread was that? Yes.
Yeah. So the reforms of Napoleon in Italy, as in the rest of Europe, varied from area to area. In Italy, the north, Lombardy in particular, but also some other parts of the north, were more adaptable, were more conducive to adapt or to adopt the Napoleonic reforms, which were, of course, part of a modernization of the state, establishing a central state and establishing a new structure. So the north was more adaptable, in part because they underwent reform period under Lombardy, underwent reform period under the Austrian Habsburgs, Maria Theresa and Joseph II, who of course ruled over Lombardy before. The south was a little bit less adaptable because remember, the south, the Kingdom of Naples, until the arrival of Napoleon, still had a feudal regime in Italy. So what Joseph, the brother of Napoleon, became the ruler, the king, he abolished in 1806, this was probably the most important reform of Joseph in the Kingdom of Naples. He abolished feudalism. But as you can imagine, there was a tremendous amount of opposition by the landlord nobility against this feudal, and so therefore it progressed very, very slowly. It was never completed. It was completed on paper, But in practice, it took time throughout the 19th century to eliminate the remnants of the feudal regime. So again, it varied from place to place. Piedmont was annexed to France, and it was again more conducive to adopt Napoleonic reforms. Rome a little bit less, because the papacy did not really accomplish many reforms before the Napoleonic arrival. So it really depended on how progressive, let's call it, the different regions were. The more progressive and the more reformistic they were before Napoleon, the more ready and ripe they were to adopt the Napoleonic reforms. I should add maybe one more thing about liberty. I think the person asked about liberty, or I don't know, national unification. Of course, the majority of the Italians still did not have a national consciousness of being completely united. There was, however, an intellectual elite, especially in the cities, that did support, in Milan and other places, that did support the unification of Italy and hope that Napoleon would bring it about. But Napoleon had no intention to unify Italy, because a unified Italy would mean a strong Italy. And he, of course, wanted to continue and rule over parts of it. So this is my, so it's a mixed picture.
Thank you. I should also point out in relation to the question and your excellent answer, when you go to the Museo del Risorgimento, of which there are many throughout Italy, I'm thinking in particular of the really big, impressive one in Milano, the first 3 rooms of this museum, which is dedicated to the unification of Italy, the first 3 rooms are dedicated to Napoleon, who in many ways is seen as the father of Italian unification, even before Garibaldi. You know, this really says a lot, that 200 some years later, the people of Italy, expressed through the museum exhibitions, are recognizing the important work that Napoleon did to unify their country.
Yeah. No, this is true. But the only thing I should say, that if it depended on Napoleon, Italy would not have been united completely.
Well, of course.
Where the unification was taking place was through the reforms. In other words, reforms that were taking place in Milan or in Naples or in Rome and other parts, they were, you know, they were equal reforms. They were French reforms. So in this sense, there was some kind of commonality to the throughout the Italian peninsula. So in this sense, there was some step towards a unification. And of course, he brought the ideas of nationalism. Right, there were Italian Jacobins who were very active, and so the ideas of nationalism came with the French invasion. So also in this sense, there was this kind of national unification.
Exactly, I agree. Are there any other questions? If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, because we're running a bit out of time here, but I want to give everybody an opportunity to ask the 2 Alexes that we have. So don't say you have a question for Alex, because I'll have no idea who it's for.
David, I forwarded a question to you from one of our listeners, from Mr. Alan
email?
Salazar.
On the chat. On the chat?
Yes, I can read it if you want.
Yeah, I don't see it, so go ahead and read it.
This is a question for Professor Tchoudinov. Despite the worsened relations among the religious communities in Egypt in the aftermath of the French occupation, do you believe, Dr. Tchoudinov, there was any positive cultural or political legacy from the occupation? Thank you.
Yes, the Egyptian historians think that there were any positive consequences of this occupation. They developed the idea that it was the genocide of the Egyptian people. In my opinion, there was one good consequence of this expedition. The Egyptians understood that they need to have such military organization as Europeans. And Muhammad Ali did it. And after this, they can adopt any other benefits of European civilization. And after the expedition of Bonaparte, no, nothing. No press, no newspapers, no theater, no aeronautic, no archaeology. The French tried to develop all these things in Egypt, but everything was rejected by Egyptian people because they did not want to get anything that was brought by enemy soldiers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I say something about this? Of course, one legacy that we have about this is the famous, I think about 20 huge volumes called the Description de l'Egypte, which was established by the institute that Napoleon established. He brought with him about 160 or 170 savants, geographers, archaeologists, historians, biologists, etc. And they toured Egypt and they explored it. And the result of this was these huge volumes that you can see today in also in French libraries called Description de l'Egypte. And of course, you have the Rosetta Stone, right? The famous Rosetta Stone that was discovered by a soldier, by a French soldier.
It was a great thing for the French culture.
Right, that's true.
Egyptian. For Egyptian,
right.
nothing.
Right, yeah, that's true. You're right.
Yes, the Description d'Egypte, which, by the way, you can also buy individual engravings, because they not only published the books, but they also sold engravings from the book, which I have a couple of. And you mentioned the Institut d'Egypte. When I was in Cairo, one of the neatest things that I got to see, there were 3 houses that they commandeered for the meetings of that group. One of them still remains, and you can go into the house in the section of Cairo and actually see where Napoleon was meeting with the people that he assembled there. It's really quite an impressive thing to see. Maybe not quite at the level of the pyramids, but it's still for we who study Napoleonic history, it's pretty impressive. I have another question here for Alexander Grad. It says, my question is about the Illyrian provinces and its geopolitics. What was its geopolitical importance apart from cutting Austria off from the sea? Did Napoleon consider these provinces a part of Italy? Okay,
so the Illyrian provinces, right, which is today part of Croatia and Bosnia, in other words, the former Yugoslavia. In 1806, in 1806, Napoleon when he took Veneto, the Veneto from the Austrians, he also took from them these areas, right, which he called the Illyrian provinces, and annexed them to the Kingdom of Italy. But in 1809, he separated those areas from the Kingdom of Italy, and he established this as a separate unit called the Illyrian provinces, which lasted until 1813, when the Austrians took them, conquered them, and then invaded the Kingdom of Italy. The importance, I think the importance of the Illyrian provinces is again establishing French control over the Adriatic Sea in order to prevent a smuggling of English goods through the Adriatic Sea. So he had a control over the Italian coast, and he wanted the control also over the former Yugoslavia, today Croatian coast. So this is the importance, I think, of the Illyrian provinces in the eyes of Napoleon. Now, of course, he introduced a whole variety of changes also into the Illyrian provinces, but the rule there lasted only for about 4 years, and therefore they didn't leave such a huge mark. But nonetheless, it was another province, another Napoleonic province, but primarily to seal the Adriatic coast from against English goods.
Right. Thank you very much for that excellent answer. And with that, we will conclude this session. I want to thank Professor Landis and the two Alexes who are with us today for their excellent presentations. I again want to thank my good friend Alexander Perez for giving me the honor of chairing this session, and I will turn it back to him now. Thank you all very much. It was an excellent group of papers.
Thank you very much.